Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Jonathan Neumann. I hope I'm pronouncing it's Neumann. I hope it's not something weird like Neumann or something, but Jonathan Neumann, author of To Heal the World, which I will bring up on the screen right now. You can get it at Amazon and all other big outlets. Thank you very much. Welcome, Jonathan.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. People hear about this all the time about the word, the phrase tikkun olam or tikkun olam, however you want to pronounce it. And I've written about it a little bit. I've shown that it's pretty much garbage, but you destroy it. You really, this is as thorough a debunking of that idea as I could. Can you first just go through the idea of where it came from and where how it entered our everyday political thinking?
Sure thing. Yeah, and thank you very much for your kind words, and of course for inviting me to be on to speak to you and our viewers. The where the idea comes from in its kind of current meaning, we'll leave aside. We can come back later, maybe, to the appearances of tikkun olam or derivatives of the phrase tikkun olam in the biblical and rabbinic canon in the Jewish tradition. But where it comes in its recent formulation, the roots of it are actually in classical reform Judaism from Germany and Central Europe. Not so much the phrase itself, but the beginnings of this kind of idea of social justice. Responding to the emancipation, the reform movement wanted to integrate as fully as possible into contemporary Germany, and part of that process was sort of aping the culture around them, and that then got these sort of a philosophical basis for that, with this idea of what they call the prophetic tradition, the prophetic legacy, the prophetic spirit, what have you. This idea that within Judaism, and particularly within the books of the prophets, there is this sort of universalistic religion that kind of does away with the legalistic and ritualistic Mosaic Judaism. That they make this sort of distinction, and they say that actually this universalistic religion, that's the real essence of what Judaism is, and that found kind of a welcome in people like Immanuel Kant and Julius Wellhausen. Outside of the Jewish community, people are not particularly fond of Judaism, and this was the way of sort of apologizing for it, to say no, this is really a kind of universalistic religion. And the sort of universalistic morals of kind of Kantian Germany became the sort of religion of the creed of this new denomination, and this was then kind of exported into the United States. Now, in kind of the mid to late 19th century, this is in America. It's more of a kind of idealistic idea, and you start to see in the 1885 Pittsburgh platform of the Reform Movement, an unofficial platform, but was then endorsed by the leadership, and its drafters became the leaders of the Reform Movement in the next generation. They started talking about the evils in the present organization of society. So suddenly that they wanted to resolve. So suddenly these ideas of kind of social justice start to take on more kind of political undertones, but still it's a kind of idealized utopianist vision. There wasn't really that kind of political activity that we associate today. The main turning point comes in the early decades of the 20th century with the social gospel. This is a liberal Christian movement led by preachers, ministers, academics who are kind of openly socialist and kind of fundamentally statist, and they engage in this kind of political, what was then liberal political work, radical political work. And the reason they were so statist was because they advocated postmillennialism, a Christian theology that believed that Christ could only return after 1,000 years of the kingdom of God on earth, social justice on earth, rather than his second coming initiating that period. So it was up to humanity to introduce this 1,000 years of social justice, and the only instrument that could do that, was powerful enough to do that, was the state. So, and they talked about the state as being divine in its essence. And they had the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This idea of the kingdom of God being built on earth, and this was the social gospel movement. And the Reform Jews, the classical Reform Jews, took an enormous inspiration from this, and part of this tradition of simulating what was going on in the society around them in order to integrate further, and of course because they sympathized with these politics, and they got involved in this sort of politics as well, and even overtook the Christians in their zeal for this. But of course the Christians had a name for this. They called it social gospel, and the Jews didn't really have an obviously Jewish name for it. And the first appearance then of this term tikkun olam in this context that I found, and it's a bit earlier than some of what others have found, is in the writings of Mordecai Kaplan, who of course went on to found the Reconstructionist movement, where he draws on the Aleinu prayer, which is familiar to us. It comes from, of course, the Malchuyot, the kingship prayers in the Yomim Noraim Musaf, and is then brought into the end of all the 3 daily services and other services as well. And he says, we cannot consider ourselves servants of the divine king unless we take upon ourselves the task to perfect the world under the kingdom of the Almighty. And the reason that I think that he was drawn to this phrase is because it talks about the kingdom of the Almighty. There it is again, this kingdom of God idea that the Christians were so keen on, and here we are introducing it, litaken olam malchut shakai, as it says in Aleinu, and it was that kingdom of God part that I think appealed to them at first, or appealed to him at first, and it was only later that this phrase tikkun olam, the first part of that phrase, becomes popularized. Now, the phrase doesn't become a big deal for several decades. It doesn't really feature in any of the sort of introduction to Judaism books in the post-war period. And it's only really in the 80s that it's popularized by Jewish radicals, foremost amongst them Michael Lerner, who founds Tikkun magazine. And those radicals, looking for some kind of Hebraic appellation for the left-wing and radical politics that they were engaged in and promoting, they adopt this term, they popularize this term, and then it's adopted by the reform and conservative movements in the 80s and 90s, and then comes into the mainstream in the way that we see it today. So it's remarkable that this concept that people think is sort of hundreds, thousands of years old is really much more recent, and the term that we use to describe it is incredibly recent. That it's actually for most people within living memory, and yet we think that it's this great tenet of Judaism that has existed from time immemorial. So that's just in brief, kind of how the term developed.
So it's really ironic that it is considered such a Jewish term, but the concept behind it is really, as you show in your book, it's a Christian concept. I mean, this social gospel is really a Christian concept, and it was an attempt to create a Judaism, and again, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but to create a Judaism that is based away from ritual and more or towards these social justice type issues.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, as I discuss in the book, obviously reform changed. Classical reform morphed into modern reform, but that emphasis, and of course the other progressive denominations as well, but that emphasis on social justice always stayed. And while the sort of theological framework began as a kind of Christian idea, ultimately, at the end of the day, just as it was, I think, for the Christians, certainly it is for the Jews, this is a political enterprise at the end of the day. And at its heart, this is about left-wing political views and trying to give them this sort of added legitimacy, this imprimatur of the Jewish tradition by appealing to these texts and sort of misreading them and distorting them and so on, in order to give it that imprimatur. But at its heart, it is a political enterprise. Now, I should emphasize, of course, thank God we live in democracies, and everyone is absolutely entitled to their views, and a diversity of political views is welcome, and they should absolutely be argued out in the public square. No one's disputing that. The question simply is, what is Judaism's position on these views, if it has one at all? And crucially, and my interest is, are the claims that they make about the Jewish tradition justifying their politics and these very specific policy prescriptions, are those claims justified? And as I go through in the book chapter by chapter, I find that they're not. They just don't stand up to scrutiny.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of what you go through is you show, especially from the Reform movement, an attempt to put a theological and a biblical, imprimatur on top of this idea of social justice, and which I was not aware of. One of them, and a lot of it is to really disconnect Judaism from Revelation and to create a whole new theory of Revelation that has nothing to do effectively with God. And the first one, which again, and I'd like you to describe it, but I forgot the name of the person that did it, but it was one of the Reform leaders, about the actual creation story and how critical that is to this, the current concept of Tikkun Olam. Can you go over that, please?
Sure. Yeah. So Tikkun Olam is the theology underlying it is sort of stridently universalistic. The idea is that we're not engaging with the rest of the world sort of as Jews and non-Jews. We're engaged as human beings and fellow human beings, and they want to break down the barriers between Jews and non-Jews. But of course that's intention. That is in tension with traditionalist Judaism, which has always held that the Jews are a distinct people with a mission in the world. That's not to say that the Jews are a superior people or whatever. It's simply that the Jews are elect, the Jews are chosen by God to fulfill a certain role in the world, and as the Bible says, in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, that the descendants of Abraham will bring blessing into the world. Now, it's not entirely clear how that happens, but clearly, in some way, the Jews, being a distinct people, the Jews enduring, persisting, brings benefit to mankind. That's the traditional view, and that's in tension with the Tikkun Olam position, because the Tikkun Olam movement wants to break down that barrier between Jews and non-Jews. And the way that they do that is by rooting moral obligation and commandedness, if you will, in creation, in the creation of human beings in the image of God in the creation story. And the reason, of course, is because creation implicates all of humankind. Everyone, as it were, was present at creation through Adam and Eve. Everyone is there. In Judaism, in traditional Judaism, moral obligation and commandedness are rooted in revelation at Horeb, in the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people specifically, and the only people at Horeb are the Jews. So you have this distinction, and that at Horeb you have this kind of establishment or underscoring of the covenant between the Jewish nation and God, and therefore obligations, special obligations between Jews and fellow Jews, just like there are special obligations within a family, that one is first and foremost concerned with the other members of one's family. That doesn't mean, of course, one is concerned with strangers or people outside of the family, but there's a sort of hierarchy of concerns, or concentric circles, however you want to look at it. But the Tikkun Olam movement dispenses with that and says, no, we're going to drop revelation. We're going to go to creation, where all people have the same origin, and therefore they want to claim all people have the same rights and obligations to one another. There is no special relationship, and the implication as well is that all human beings have a common destiny as well. So if everyone has a common origin and common obligations and rights and a common destiny as well, then really we're basically all the same. And the role, of course, the purpose of creation, the command of that moral obligation of creation, is to pursue social justice, to pursue what is today these left-wing policy views and left-wing politics. So that's crucial to them. But then, of course, you have this question: well, why is there a Jewish people? What did happen at Revelation? What did happen at Horeb? What was that message? Because they're still trying to work within the parameters of Jewish text, so they have to have answers to these questions. Of course, if they wanted to just establish their own philosophy and do their own politics, that would be fine. Their problem is that they're trying to use the creation story in the Bible to serve their purposes, so they have to then deal with some of these other questions. So what do you do with Revelation, which is probably the biggest single event that happened, certainly the biggest single event that happens in the Bible possibly with the exception of the Abraham being chosen in the first place. So how do they deal with that? What was the purpose of creation? What were the Jews doing there? What message did they receive? And they struggle with that question. They don't really have an answer. And they don't like the idea of Jews having a special role or having got a particular or special message. They see that as chauvinistic, somehow making the Jews apart and perhaps better than other people for having got this special message. So all they can sort of suggest is, well, the Jews just got a kind of echo of that original message. They just got a repetition. A revelation just taught them again that they need to pursue social justice. But of course, that was the message from creation in the first place. So if revelation is meant to sort of set the Jews apart, how can it set them apart if it's giving them exactly the same message as they had in creation? It can't be that the thing that makes the Jews different is also what makes them exactly the same as everybody else. So it's not at all a compelling response, and it's one that they aren't even really particularly satisfied with, because they also find even that sort of meager explanation and justification for the Jewish people to be too chauvinistic. And at the end of the day, really, we're all just equally commanded to pursue social justice, and there isn't really an answer to these questions. But this is kind of fundamental to the Tikkun Olam endeavor, at least from a theological point of view.
And it, as you point out, it's very interesting because obviously, if you actually are familiar with the Torah, you see that the creation story and then the flood story, which could also be regarded as a universalistic message, Noahide laws, that sort of thing, is quickly followed. Both of those stories are followed by tragedies, and which lead to Abraham being a particular person that receives God's word and receives the prophecy, and that's quite deliberate. That God has given up on the universalistic message and decided, I'm going to choose for a people. So it's really the exact opposite of what they're saying, and again, it's just a bizarre thing. Another thing you thought, which I thought was amusing, is they have the left points to the story of Joseph as sort of like their go-to story to prove that socialism is the biblical way to go. I was wondering if you can go through that, because that was very amusing.
Yeah, so this is one of the there are a number of sources, the ones that I go through chapter by chapter, a number of sources that they bring that really encapsulate their worldview. So as you said, creation is one of them. Abraham appealing for the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah is another. Joseph's economic policies in Egypt are another. Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, the books of the prophets, and then these various appearances of Tikkun Olam and a few other important psukim verses in the Torah. And that's then the kind of structure of the central part of the book is to go through each of those and consider the claims that they make and whether those claims stand up. And as you say, in the case of the story of Joseph, they want to suggest that here you have Joseph is confronted with this national crisis of famine in Egypt, and the solution that he proposes is to inject the state into the matter, and to collect grain over the 7 years of plenty, and then redistribute it in the 7 years of famine. And they say, look, this is a great example of a kind of benevolent use of government. And yet, of course, if you actually read the story, and this is not rabbinic interpretations. In fact, actually, some of the rabbis try to play down what the Torah actually says in its plain meaning, which is essentially that Joseph uses Joseph uses the crisis, doesn't let a crisis go to waste. He uses the opportunity essentially to buy the Egyptian people and all of their possessions that they start off by. Instead of redistributing the grain for free, he sells it back to them in those 7 years of famine. He starts off, he takes their money for it, and then he takes their livestock for it, and then eventually their land and even themselves, and they become serfs to Pharaoh. And it's strange. You can understand that those looking at this from a more kind of politically conservative point of view or libertarian point of view, to say, well, actually, the critiques that conservatives and libertarians have of big government is precisely that it can bring about dependency and even slavery, whether in a literal sense or a metaphorical sense. There's great dependency on the state, and if you wanted to take the story politically, that actually appears to be exactly what it's saying. Now, traditionally, we don't really read the story in those kind of political or economic terms, or certainly not as, that's not our emphasis. But if you do want to emphasize it the way that they do, it just seems incredibly strange. Of all the stories to pick, you'd pick that one to make this case. It seems to say exactly, as you say, the opposite, I think.
Because what happens in the end? What happens to the people in the end? They become slaves. It's a strange, unless that's the point of socialism, that's that is a very strange message that you would want to give to people as being the best example. Another part about that you have in your book is you do go through. I mean, the concept of tikkun olam is not completely foreign to Judaism. It's used in rabbinic literature, a number of cases, but it's not what anybody's really saying it is. In fact, it's not really clear what it is altogether. Can you just go, as far as you could tell, as far as you could synthesize, what do the words tikkun olam mean in, and it's really all rabbinic Judaism, but what does it mean?
Yeah. So just checking you can hear me, because I think there was a bit of a cutout. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So it's interesting you mentioned that it's of course rabbinic, and I think that's also important to mention. The phrase tikkun olam, again, this concept that from time immemorial doesn't appear anywhere in the Tanakh, in the Bible at all. Not just in the Torah, nowhere in the Bible at all. Now that's remarkable. Today vast swathes of Jews, particularly American Jews, believe that tikkun olam is like a center of Judaism, a central tenet, a mitzvah, equal to all of the rest of Judaism. And yet it's not mentioned a single time, at least explicitly, in the Torah. Now that may seem, just a semantic criticism, but I think it's pretty telling. There's every major concept in Judaism features somewhere in the Bible, almost invariably explicitly, sometimes a bit less explicitly, but everything from Jewish chosenness, the election of the Jewish people, the land of Israel, as we said, creation, revelation, Shabbat, Tefillin, Kashrut, Mezuzot, the Messianic age. All of these things are there. You just open it and you can see them there. And yet this concept that apparently is at least on a par with all of those, if not even more important, doesn't appear a single time. That's remarkable. Now, even the word tikkun, which in rabbinic Hebrew is one of the most malleable terms there is, only appears 3 times in the Bible, all in Kohelet, in the book of Ecclesiastes, and in none of those cases has any reference, any relation to tikkun olam or the way that we understand it today. So essentially, this thing doesn't appear at all in the Bible. So where does it appear? It appears in kind of 4 main places. First, in the Aleinu prayer. As we mentioned before, and this is sort of the original source. Now, there it says this idea of perfecting the world, repairing the world, or healing the world, as the title of the book, more poetically, under the kingdom of God. You're perfecting the world, whatever, under the kingdom of God. But the paragraph in which it's situated, the second paragraph of Aleinu, is a sort of universalistic paragraph that complements the sort of the first particularistic one. But the second paragraph is calling for almost kind of literal iconoclasm. That everyone in the world, you'll destroy their idols, and everyone in the world will worship the God of Israel, the one God. And although we don't of course take that in a literal sense, that's a very far cry from the politics of of social justice. Moreover, of course, it's inherent to social justice, as it was with the social gospel, that this is something that man has to do. We can't just rely on God to do social justice. We have to be active. We have to go out and protest. We have to advocate. We have to vote for these politicians. We have to run for office and all of that. And yet, the paragraph begins, therefore we put our hope in you, right? That we put our hope in God to do this perfecting of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that man can't be involved in the perfecting the world, as Aleinu says, but it's interesting that the emphasis is clearly on God doing that, which is why we don't take that iconoclasm literally. I'll just say as an aside that it's almost certain that this phrase litaken olam, to perfect the world, fix the world, or what have you, is a corruption of litachen olam, so with a kaf rather than a kuf, and litachen olam, you see it in kind of a medieval Machzorim and Siddurim, particularly in the Sephardi tradition, and it still survives to this day in Yemenite Yemenite Machzorim. And there's a couple of reasons why it seems like it's the more likely correct version. One is that whenever you talk about kingdoms being established or thrones being established, for example, in the Bible where it talks about Jonathan's throne being established, it uses this verse litachen, not litaken. And the second reason, of course, is it makes a lot more sense because kingdoms are established; they're not perfected. What does that mean for a kingdom to be perfected? And it's of course obvious, given the semantic similarity, why that became corrupted. So just in Aleinu, you see how actually it's got nothing to do with Tikkun Olam as social justice and left-wing politics today, and probably not even for man to do. And the phrase Tikkun Olam probably actually doesn't really appear in there correctly at all. And it's even the more remarkable because that, of course, is the source for this phrase Tikkun Olam in current usage. So even the original source that they use is probably not actually correct. So that's one of the sources. Another one is in the Talmud and kind of rabbinic responsa, halachic responsa over the last 2,000 years, and in those cases it's used as tweaks to particular existing laws that make them a bit more consistent or closing kind of loopholes. So the prosbul, for example, is done mipnei tikkun haolam, for the sake of tikkun haolam, whatever exactly that means. We translate as the better ordering of society or what have you. And the prosbul was, as you know, an instrument to encourage lending in the 6th year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, because debts would be forgiven in the 7th year, so people wouldn't lend in the 6th year. And this was a mechanism by which you could still hold the debt past that year, to resolve this problem. Another was in divorce law. There's a few in divorce. That's probably the main way that this tikkun olam idea is used in the Talmud, that a man could send a get, a writ of divorce, to his wife via an emissary, a shaliach, and if he could change his mind after the emissary has left, and the get would become invalid, but the emissary wouldn't know, and the wife wouldn't know, and she could of course go on then to remarry wherever she is and potentially have children who would be of a very sort of dubious and status, and it would be an all-round disaster, not to mention grossly inequitable and unfair to the wife. So mipnei tikkun olam, they stopped this practice that you can change your mind. And what's extraordinary, as much as they like to jump on this tikkun olam in the Talmud idea as being a sort of a justification for these grand systemic changes to our society today, actually the Talmud takes a much more modest view. If anything, it seems like tikkun olam is trying to make these sorts of gradualist reforms and fixes in order to keep the system, not to overthrow it. And more remarkably, there's potentially so much use for a term like this when you think about it. I mean, there is, in a sense, no end to the things that you could do with it. So it's incredibly telling that the rabbis are so sparing in their use of it. Even in the Talmud, it appears almost exclusively in one chapter of Gittin, one tractate of the entire Talmud. So even the Talmudic rabbis are barely using it, and then in the rest of the rabbinic responsa, it's barely being cited at all either. Then there are a couple of, handful of appearances in the Midrash, which tend to be much more Kabbalistic. Again, nothing to do remotely with politics. And then one of the most famous appearances in the Kabbalistic tradition, particularly in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, Yitzchak Luria, about 400 or so years ago. And there, this idea of tikkun is to fix, and it starts to get very kind of esoteric, to fix the broken shards. These are all kind of spiritual shards that were broken by the force of divinity contracting from God's creation. And the first time it happens, and then God fixes it himself, and the second time it happens at the creation of Adam, and now it's left basically to man to fix. And the way that the Kabbalists understand it is that it can be fixed by mitzvot, by doing mitzvot, and prayer with the right kavanah, with the right intention. So essentially, doing normative halachic Judaism, perhaps with particular intentions, and that's what sort of fixes these vessels, returns the light that was expelled from the vessels when they broke, returning that light to God. And we see here, yes, we see that man, or at least the Jews, have a role in this kind of tikkun, Kabbalistic tikkun, but again, absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with politics, not even to do with the material world. These are completely otherworldly, kind of esoteric, spiritual, Kabbalistic notions. There aren't physical vessels. There isn't a physical light, let alone that being returned by going out and protesting a particular piece of legislation. So those are the kind of the main four sources of Tikkun Olam, and you can see none of them have any bearing whatsoever on the way that Tikkun Olam is currently understood. This is a completely new concept with no basis, at least not in those sources of Tikkun Olam itself. So they're just places really not to look if you want to, if advocates of social justice today want to find sources in Judaism, they're certainly not going to find them in these appearances of Tikkun Olam.
You spend a little bit of time in the book, and in the title of the book as well, about how this concept of social justice and of tikkun olam is actually dangerous to Israel. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Just as with the kind of general politics advocated in the name of social justice, tikkun olam, Jewish social justice, they have these political views before they open the Bible or the Talmud. There's no real encounter with these texts. There's no real honest encounter. There's no real learning going on. They're not here to learn from the text. They're here to teach the text what they already think. And the same is true of Israel. And actually, it was seeing these liberal and radical Jews expressing their hostility and animosity towards Israel by reference to Judaism. That was one of the things that prompted me to take an interest and investigate this phenomenon and write the book. One of a number of things, but incredibly kind of powerful to me. This idea that Jews are going out and advocating against Israel with reference to Judaism, that somehow Judaism could justify this animosity towards Israel. So they have their politics first. The question is, where did this politics come from? And it's my contention that they come from the Cold War. They come from Jewish radicals in the 1960s, and I say Jewish radicals, by which I mean radicals who happen to be Jews, because being sort of assimilating and dropping the Judaism part was integral to that universalistic radicalism. And they were engaged in the sort of the more militant protest against the Vietnam War, the more militant aspects of the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers and so on, and also cheerleading for the Soviet Union. And that's at the heart of this, that America was wrong, on the wrong side, and Israel by extension were on the wrong side of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was on the right side, and Arab states and the Arab proxies were on the right side. And these Jews nonetheless still felt, despite their ambivalence towards their Jewish heritage, still felt a certain kind of latent guilt or responsibility, one might say, for Israel's particular, Israel's transgression. So this was a part of the Cold War they actually were particularly invested in. This was tied up also with their kind of return to Judaism and Jewish identity. It was part of a movement towards this kind of identity politics and minority pride throughout the 1970s, throughout American society. And they form an organization through after some small organizations, Chavurot and so on, they come together and form an organization called Brera, which is means in Hebrew alternative, and it came from the Israeli adage En Brera, there is no alternative, by which Israelis meant there is no alternative but to prevail in the existential war that the Arabs were inflicting on Israel. Now, this organization, Brera, in America, decided that actually, or implied at least, that there was such an alternative, and that alternative seemed to consist in negotiation with the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, that was engaged at the time in pioneering an unrepentant terrorism against Israeli, Jewish, and Western targets, hijacking planes and the like, and of course was an ally of the Soviet Union. Be'era came under pressure from the Jewish community, which was ready for that sort of hostility towards Israel, and it disbanded. They then come together again. Similar circles come together in the 1980s and form a group called New Jewish Agenda. Now, New Jewish Agenda decided that instead of going down Be'era's path of focusing exclusively on Israel, it would take a different tack. It would dilute Israel amongst all the other issues of social justice concerning them at the time, radical views on nuclear disarmament, on race relations, minority relations, and so on. What New Jewish Agenda did was also popularize tikkun olam, popularize this use of Jewish sources and this kind of Hebraic appellations to their politics, again as part of this move back towards Jewish identity. And we're talking about people like Michael Lerner, Arthur Waskow, who both went on to become rabbinic, to receive rabbinic ordination, whether dubiously or not, from certain denominations, organizations, and so on. So it's all kind of part of this trend. They popularized, New Jewish Agenda really popularized Tikkun Olam, and particularly Tikkun magazine that Michael Lerner founded in the 1980s did a huge amount to popularize this term. But New Jewish Agenda, even while diluting Israel amongst all these other issues, still came under pressure from the community and also internecine fighting and budgetary issues and so on, and collapsed. So in our times now, you have the acolytes of some of these older figures in the radical movement, and they're now kind of faced with a dilemma. Do they go down the Be'era route of focusing exclusively on Israel? Do they go down a route like New Jewish Agenda of diluting issues amongst diluting Israel amongst other issues? Do they avoid talking about Israel altogether? Those are the kind of the three choices that they face, and pretty much all social justice organizations can be fitted into any one of those categories. What's interesting is that most of them are in the "we're not going to deal with Israel at all" category. Now, partly that's because they're sort of single issue groups, but that shouldn't be mistaken for ambivalence towards Israel or kind of support or positivity towards it. It usually hides a negativity. So, for example, there are social justice campaigners in Israel or other kind of charitable organizations in Israel who complain that these organizations won't work with them. And again, because they have this reticence to work with Israel. There was one of them, for example, that wanted to take alumni of its programs to Israel in order to do some programming. So that was a case where they actually did think about engaging with Israel in some way, and they got a letter from 100 of their alumni saying that it would discriminate against the anti-Zionists among them for them to do that, because the anti-Zionists couldn't participate in that program. So they should call it off completely and do something else. And that's what they did. They called it off because they decided that, well, we can't alienate the people who despise Israel. So we'll have to do some other program. We can't work with Israel at all. So that's part of what's going on with most of these organizations that don't touch Israel. And another aspect of it as well is they may be worried that it's going to hurt with some of their donors, that even in the mainstream community that is supportive of a lot of this social justice stuff, when it comes to Israel, they can still be a bit more sensitive. But we'll see how long that lasts. Be'era, New Jewish Agenda collapsed, but Tikkun magazine, J Street in another sense, and other organizations seem to be persisting and some of them even thriving. So clearly the community has shifted. J Street's an interesting one. Not all organizations that are kind of hostile to Israel, and I put in that category a spectrum of groups that are sort of hostile to Israeli government policy, but usually that's government policy that would be enacted by any conceivable Israeli government. So it's not just opposition to the Netanyahu government; it's basically opposition to any conceivable government doing these policies as they would, all the way to the Jewish state needs to kind of burn in hell. So all on that spectrum of all of the not all of those groups cite social justice or tikkun olam as a motivation for the work that they do and their views, but all the groups that cite tikkun olam and social justice are on that spectrum, on that kind of hostile to Israel or anti-Israel spectrum. So clearly tikkun olam has, what I call in the book, an Israel problem. And J Street's interesting in this because J Street doesn't cite social justice as one of its motivations, but interestingly, J Street U, its college branch, does cite social justice as one of its motivations. And one of J Street U's first acts was to drop pro-Israel from the group's, pro-Israel, pro-peace mantra. So that's this kind of milieu of what we're looking at. As I said, not all anti-Israel groups cite social justice, but all groups that cite social justice to Tikkun Olam are hostile to Israel in some form. So that's where we're at. But as I said, the politics always comes first, and the danger that the Tikkun Olam poses to Israel and to the Jewish community in its Zionism and connection with Israel is that it seems to lend a kind of Jewish imprimatur again to these radical politics and to this hostility to Israel. That suddenly it seems like, oh well, actually I can be a good Jew and be anti-Israel, or indeed Judaism requires me to be anti-Israel. And on the far end of this, in fact, not even so much on the far end, it's making inroads really, is a kind of diasporist Judaism. This idea that actually we oppose Israel so much that we're going to try to mine Judaism for sources that we're then going to misread and distort in order to make a case for Israel not really needing to exist at all, that actually the land of Israel doesn't need to be central to Judaism at all, and that we're perfectly fine, and in fact it's preferable to have Jewish life in the diaspora in perpetuity, which has never been the Jewish position. Exile has always been seen as an adverse condition, as a bad thing, and eventually the Jews will return. Now, there are some rabbis who have held the view that there are good things that can come out of exile, that we need to, for example, in some interpretations of Lurianic Kabbalah, there are things that we need to do in exile first in order to go back. But at the end of the day, there is always the return. And again, in a sort of nice circle, this takes us back to classical Reform Judaism, that in its attempt to integrate in Germany a couple of hundred years ago, it had to, the cost of that was to say, well, we're going to drop the idea of Jewish nation, we're going to drop the idea of going back to the land of Israel. Germany is now our promised land, and Berlin is our Zion. So there are these kind of theological resources that they can mine, but today, but that has not been the position of traditionalist Judaism at all. There are no sources that suggest that the land of Israel is not absolutely central to Jewish life. Different question whether it's incumbent on everyone to make Aliyah right now, but certainly eschatologically, this sort of the messianic framework, absolutely the land of Israel is at the center. And social justice, which believes we need to be in the diaspora in order to do this social justice work, can't really reconcile itself to that.
Yeah, I know that Judith Butler pushes this idea of diasporic Judaism being the authentic Judaism, and of course she has no Jewish qualifications whatsoever, and but it's people think that her prose is so dense that she must know what she's talking about.
Exactly.
We are running out of time. Do you have any insights in what's happening right now with all the protests that are happening worldwide, all of the anti-racist protests? Is your impression of that this is that this is also a cover for political movements that are meant to go beyond just anti-racism, or I know it's certainly trying to be hijacked by the anti-Israel crowd, but what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, one absolutely not only has to acknowledge, but I think be mindful of and campaign against racism towards other minorities, in particular towards African Americans and the Black community. And of course, there's no question that we're particularly sensitive to this as Jews, not only historically and even today, that we've also suffered. So absolutely, there's no question that this is an evil. And I don't have time for people who just sort of dismiss the idea that there is racism towards other minorities because they don't like the direction where these protests are going. So one absolutely has to appreciate that, and it's right that we make an effort to try to redress those issues. But at the same time, there's no contradiction between that and pointing out that some of these protests are completely out of hand. Some of them obviously going into an anti-Semitic direction, and unfortunately, that's not just sort of a few fringe groups. It's at the heart of a lot of what the ideology underpinning some of the radicals who are hijacking this cause. All this intersectionality that believes that you can't fight one kind of injustice without fighting other kinds of injustice. And of course, as with any other value system that there's ever been in the world, the Jews are always on the wrong side of the equation. It doesn't matter what the equation is. If you're a communist, the Jews are capitalist. If you're a capitalist, the Jews are communist. And if you're an anti-racist, the Jews are racist. And if you're standing up for racism towards black people and people of color, then the Jews are white oppressors. So that is fundamentally, of course, problematic, and something that we shouldn't be afraid to call out as Jews. There's no contradiction between that and supporting supporting the black community in actual tangible ways that can help them. Destroying Fifth Avenue doesn't help anyone, but there are tangible things that we can do to support the black community, African American community, and other communities that are suffering racism. We can't turn a blind eye to that. But the idea of taking down all these kind of historical symbols of oppression, there needs to be a more serious conversation. I mean, if everyone does this, there'll be no history left. I mean, I'm not the first person to point out that if the Jews were to insist on that, there wouldn't be any statues left, there wouldn't be any flags left. Between the number of countries that have expelled us and the number of political leaders and cultural leaders who have done us harm and continue to do us harm, there's no end to it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide more historical context for these monuments and these symbols and so on. So, too many conversations have been kind of conflated, and as you say, unfortunately, been hijacked by radicals who don't really have the interest of the communities they purport to represent in mind. And we shouldn't be afraid to call out the anti-Semitism that emerges from some pockets in these movements, but at the same time and without any contradiction, be absolutely ready to stand alongside African American communities and our neighbors and other minorities who are suffering from racism, and it is obvious. It's not something that I think one can hide away from. But unfortunately, we're in a situation at the moment, not just with this, but even more broadly politically, that we're not really able to have nuanced conversations. We're not really able to talk to one another, and the only way that people express themselves these days is by trying to burn things down. So it's a very sad, I think, very sad state of affairs.
Thank you very much. This is enjoyable. Again, for the people that are not familiar with it, this is Jonathan Neumann has written this book called To Heal the World. It came out a couple of years ago. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a really, really great takedown of the entire concept of Tikkun Olam, and it's actually a warning of how things are going in the Jewish world. So and one that we really need to understand. Thank you very much for being my guest, and good luck with everything that you're doing. So thanks a lot. Take care.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks.